Montana Territory, June 25, 1876. What I'm about to tell you is the untold story behind America's most famous military disaster. A story the government buried beneath the legend of Custer's last stand. While history remembers the death of George Armstrong Custer, it has forgotten 12 cavalry officers who faced an even more horrific fate at the hands of Apache warriors who had traveled north to join the greatest Indian alliance in American history. These weren't random killings or acts of savage brutality. This was calculated warfare, a message written in blood and scalps that would send shockwaves through every military fort from Montana to Texas. The Apache had perfected the art of psychological warfare for centuries, and on this day, they would demonstrate why even hardened cavalry veterans feared them more than death itself. I'll take you inside the final hours of 12 brave officers who thought they understood frontier warfare, show you how Apache tactics turned military training into useless knowledge, and reveal why the Army suppressed all records of what actually happened during those final moments when cavalry discipline collapsed into pure terror. Stay until the end because the fate of these scalps will shock you, and the Apache war chief's final words provide insight into a conflict that was never really about land. It was about the survival of two completely different ways of understanding what it means to be human. Hit that subscribe button now because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the Indian Wars. Captain William Harrison Fetterman of the 7th Cavalry had survived 3 years of Indian fighting across the Great Plains, but nothing had prepared him for the intelligence report that reached Fort Abraham Lincoln on June 20, 1876. Apache war bands from the southwest had traveled over 800 miles north to join Sitting Bull's massive encampment along the Little Bighorn River, bringing with them weapons, tactics, and a reputation for cruelty that made even veteran soldiers nervous. Fetterman commanded Company L, a unit of 43 men that included 12 officers who represented the best of frontier military leadership. His second-in-command, Lieutenant James Morrison, was a West Point graduate whose mathematical precision had earned him recognition as one of the Army's finest tacticians. Lieutenant Thomas O'Brien brought experience from campaigns against the Comanche in Texas, while Lieutenant Samuel Whitman had learned Apache fighting methods during 2 years of service in Arizona Territory. The other officers in Fetterman's command each brought unique skills that made Company L one of the most formidable units in the 7th Cavalry. Lieutenant Henry Jackson was an expert marksman who could place rifle shots with deadly accuracy at ranges that amazed his fellow soldiers. Lieutenant Charles Meyer had served as a scout and spoke several Indian dialects fluently. Lieutenant Robert Stone was known for his ability to track enemies across terrain that seemed to leave no traces. Lieutenant David Walsh had distinguished himself during the Civil War before coming west to fight Indians, bringing urban warfare tactics that had proven surprisingly effective against guerrilla fighters. Lieutenant Michael Torres, whose Mexican ancestry made him valuable in negotiations with southwestern tribes, understood the complex relationships between different Indian groups. Lieutenant John McKenzie was a former Texas Ranger whose experience with Apache raiding parties had taught him their preferred methods of ambush and retreat. Lieutenant George Patterson had studied military engineering and could fortify positions that withstood sustained attack, while Lieutenant Edward Sullivan possessed the kind of natural leadership that kept men calm during the chaos of combat. Together, these 12 officers commanded soldiers who trusted their judgment completely and had followed them through battles that had broken other units. The mission that brought Company L to the Little Bighorn region seemed straightforward. Locate and assess the strength of hostile Indian forces reported to be gathering along the river, then report back to Colonel Custer's main command. Intelligence suggested that Sitting Bull had assembled the largest concentration of Plains Indians in decades, but military planners believed this made them vulnerable to coordinated attack rather than more dangerous. What the Army didn't understand was that Apache participation had transformed this gathering from a defensive alliance into an offensive war council. The Apache had brought sophisticated knowledge of military tactics, advanced weaponry acquired through raids across the Southwest, and most importantly, a strategic understanding of how to exploit the Army's predictable methods of operation. Fetterman's company departed Fort Abraham Lincoln on June 21 with supplies for 2 weeks of independent operation and orders to maintain communication with other elements of the 7th Cavalry through a system of signal fires and messenger relays. The weather was unusually hot for late June, and the men complained about dust that seemed to penetrate everything despite their careful attention to equipment maintenance. The first 3 days of patrol passed without significant incident. They encountered scattered groups of Indians at long distance, but these contacts seemed routine. Small hunting parties that disappeared quickly when cavalry approached. Fetterman's officers noted these sightings in their daily reports but saw no pattern that suggested coordinated hostile activity. On June 24th, everything changed. Lieutenant Mackenzie, riding point with 2 enlisted scouts, discovered the remains of a supply wagon that had been attacked and burned sometime during the previous week. The destruction was thorough and systematic, but what troubled Mackenzie most was evidence that the attackers had taken time to mutilate the bodies of the wagon's defenders in ways that seemed designed to send a specific message. The mutilations followed Apache patterns that Mackenzie recognized from his Texas service. Tongues cut out to prevent the dead from speaking in the afterlife, eyes removed so they couldn't see the path to the spirit world, and scalps taken in a ceremonial manner that indicated this was warfare rather than simple robbery. Most disturbing was evidence that at least one victim had been kept alive for extended torture, suggesting that the attackers possessed both time and confidence that they wouldn't be interrupted. That evening, as Company L made camp in a defensive position overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley, Fetterman called his officers together for a council of war that would prove to be their final conference. The intelligence picture had shifted dramatically. They were no longer tracking scattered hostile bands, but were apparently operating in territory controlled by a sophisticated enemy force that combined Apache tactical knowledge with Plains Indian numerical superiority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption about frontier warfare and prove that some enemies couldn't be defeated through conventional military thinking. June 25, 1876, dawn. Lieutenant Morrison's meteorological training told him that the morning mist rising from the Little Bighorn River would provide perfect concealment for hostile movement, but Captain Fetterman decided to maintain their planned reconnaissance schedule despite deteriorating tactical conditions. The 12 officers spread their men across a mile-long front, using standard cavalry patrol formation that had proven effective against predictable Plains Indian tactics. What they didn't realize was that Apache War Chief Geronimo's nephew, a warrior named Nate, had spent the previous week studying their movement patterns and had identified fatal flaws in their approach to terrain evaluation. The Apache understood that white soldiers relied on maps and predictable thinking, while successful desert warfare required constant adaptation to changing conditions that couldn't be anticipated through planning. Lieutenant O'Brien, commanding the advance guard, noticed unusual bird behavior around 7:30 a.m. that suggested large-scale human movement in areas where their maps showed only empty grassland. His experience fighting Comanche had taught him to read these environmental signals, but when he reported his concerns to Fetterman, the captain dismissed them as nervousness brought on by the previous day's discovery of the burned wagon. The Apache had positioned themselves with mathematical precision that exploited every weakness in cavalry formation. Unlike Plains Indians, who typically relied on mobility and numerical superiority, Apache warriors used the landscape itself as a weapon, creating kill zones where enemy movement became predictable and escape routes could be systematically eliminated. At 8:15 a.m., Lieutenant Jackson spotted movement on a ridge approximately 800 yards to the north and raised his field glasses for a better look. What he saw was a single Apache warrior on horseback, painted for war and carrying a lance decorated with fresh scalps. The warrior made no attempt to hide, but instead seemed to be deliberately drawing attention to his location. Lieutenant Meyer, whose linguistic skills allowed him to communicate with various tribes, immediately recognized this as a tactical signal rather than random encounter. Apache warfare doctrine used individual warriors as bait to draw enemies into prepared ambush sites, and the positioning of this warrior suggested that Company L was being herded toward a specific location where terrain favored defenders over attackers. Fetterman faced a decision that would determine whether his officers lived or died: maintain their reconnaissance mission and risk walking into an obvious trap, or retreat and risk being accused of cowardice by superior officers who didn't understand Apache tactics. His military training emphasized mission accomplishment over force preservation, and the idea of being outmaneuvered by Indians conflicted with everything he'd been taught about white superiority in warfare. Lieutenant Whitman argued forcefully for immediate withdrawal, pointing out that Apache presence indicated a level of coordination and planning that exceeded anything they were equipped to handle. His experience in Arizona Territory had taught him that Apache war parties never revealed themselves unless they possessed overwhelming advantages, and this warrior's casual exposure suggested confidence that bordered on contempt. But Lieutenant Morrison's mathematical analysis suggested that retreat might be exactly what the enemy wanted, potentially exposing Company L to attack during movement across open terrain where their horses would be vulnerable and their firepower reduced. His calculations indicated that forward movement might be the lesser of two dangerous alternatives. The debate among Fetterman's officers consumed precious time while Apache warriors used their delay to complete encirclement preparations. Every minute of discussion allowed the enemy to improve their positions and reduce Company L's options, but the officers couldn't reach consensus about the best tactical response to an unprecedented situation. Lieutenant Torres, whose Mexican heritage had taught him to respect Apache military capabilities, suggested a compromise. Continue forward movement but modify their formation to provide better security against ambush. His proposal involved spreading the officers across a wider front and maintaining constant communication through hand signals rather than verbal commands that could reveal their positions. At 9:20 a.m., Captain Fetterman made the decision that sealed their fate. Company L would continue the reconnaissance mission but would modify their approach to account for possible Apache presence. The 12 officers would advance in pairs, maintaining visual contact while covering each other's movements and preparing to converge if attacked. The Apache watched these preparations with amusement and satisfaction. White soldiers always believed that minor tactical adjustments could overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages, never understanding that some battles were lost before they began through faulty assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions. As Company L resumed movement toward the Little Bighorn Valley, they carried with them the confidence of men who had survived previous battles and the tragic ignorance of soldiers who had never faced an enemy that understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. The attack began at 9:47 a.m. with a silence so complete that Lieutenant Jackson later described it as the moment the world held its breath before exploding into hell. The Apache had achieved perfect tactical surprise not through concealment but through misdirection, allowing Company L to advance into a killing ground that offered no escape and no opportunity for effective resistance. Nate had positioned his warriors with the precision of a chess master, creating overlapping fields of fire that would eliminate the cavalry's advantages in weapons and training while maximizing Apache strengths in terrain knowledge and close-quarters combat. The first volley killed 6 enlisted men instantly and wounded 4 of the 12 officers severely enough to limit their effectiveness in the battle that followed. Lieutenant Morrison, struck through the chest by an Apache arrow that penetrated his uniform coat and lodged near his heart, remained conscious long enough to understand that they were facing a level of tactical sophistication that exceeded anything in his military education. The mathematics of their situation were simple and hopeless. 43 men surrounded by an estimated 200 Apache warriors who controlled every avenue of escape. Captain Fetterman, bleeding from a head wound that had partially blinded him, tried to organize a defensive formation that would allow his surviving officers to concentrate their firepower and possibly break through the encirclement. But Apache tactics had anticipated this response, and counterattacks struck from directions that made coordinated defense impossible. Lieutenant O'Brien, drawing on his experience fighting Comanche, recognized that Apache warfare followed different rules that made conventional cavalry responses not just ineffective but counterproductive. The enemy wasn't trying to defeat them through superior firepower but was systematically eliminating their ability to fight as a coordinated unit while preparing for the close-quarters combat that would follow. The sound of battle was unlike anything the officers had experienced in previous Indian fights. Apache warriors used vocal intimidation as a weapon, creating an audio landscape of war cries, weapon impacts, and human screams that disrupted the mental focus necessary for effective resistance. Men who had remained calm during conventional battles found themselves paralyzed by sensory overload that made tactical thinking nearly impossible. Lieutenant Mackenzie, whose Texas Ranger training had prepared him for Apache methods, managed to kill 3 warriors with precise rifle shots before being overwhelmed by attackers who seemed to materialize from terrain that appeared empty moments before. His final words, recorded by Private Samuel Hayes who survived the initial assault, were, "They're ghosts who bleed real blood." The Apache understood that psychological warfare was as important as physical violence in defeating enemies who relied on discipline and mutual support. They deliberately targeted officers first, using their knowledge of military hierarchy to create chaos among enlisted men who had been trained to follow orders rather than think independently under extreme stress. Lieutenant Stone, attempting to organize a fighting retreat toward higher ground, discovered that the Apache had predicted this tactical response and had prepared positions that turned retreat into a running battle where cavalry horses became liabilities rather than assets. The terrain that appeared to offer sanctuary actually created channels where warriors could attack from concealment while preventing effective return fire. By 10:15 a.m., effective resistance had collapsed. 9 of the 12 officers were dead or 2 severely wounded to command, and the surviving enlisted men had fragmented into small groups that could be eliminated individually. The Apache began the systematic elimination of resistance that would continue for another 40 minutes and establish their reputation as the most feared warriors in North America. Lieutenant Walsh, dying from multiple wounds but still conscious, witnessed the beginning of scalping rituals that would haunt the few survivors for the rest of their lives. The Apache didn't take scalps as trophies or symbols of victory, but as spiritual weapons that would carry the power of defeated enemies into future battles. Each scalping followed precise ceremonial requirements that transformed individual deaths into collective victories. The remaining 3 officers, Lieutenants Sullivan, Patterson, and Torres, found themselves isolated from their men and facing the choice between surrender and death in combat. Their military training had never prepared them for this decision, because Army doctrine assumed that surrender to Indians was equivalent to torture and death anyway. Lieutenant Torres, whose Mexican heritage allowed him to understand some Apache language, heard war chants that suggested this battle was being conducted as a religious ceremony rather than simple military action. The warriors weren't just killing enemies, but were participating in a spiritual transformation that would carry sacred power back to their people. As the final phase of the battle began, the Apache prepared for the close-quarters combat that would complete their victory and demonstrate why even experienced cavalry officers feared them more than death itself. The scalping would come later, but first came the systematic elimination of every man who had dared to enter their territory with weapons and hostile intentions. The final phase of combat began when Apache warriors transitioned from ranged attacks to close-quarters killing that demonstrated their mastery of weapons and tactics the cavalry had never encountered. Lieutenant Sullivan, bleeding from wounds in his shoulder and leg, found himself facing warriors who moved with fluid precision that turned hand-to-hand combat into a deadly art form. Nate himself participated in the killing of Captain Fetterman, using a war club that had been blessed by Apache medicine men and carried the spiritual power of previous victories. The captain's death took nearly 10 minutes of sustained brutality that was designed to demonstrate Apache dominance over white military power while serving religious purposes that transformed killing into sacred ceremony. Lieutenant Patterson, the military engineer whose fortification expertise had seemed valuable during planning, discovered that Apache warriors understood defensive positions better than the officers who built them. His attempt to create a stronghold using available rocks and fallen timber was systematically dismantled by enemies who anticipated every defensive measure and countered with tactics that turned protection into vulnerability. The Apache had developed scalping techniques that maximized both psychological impact and spiritual significance. They didn't simply remove scalps as battle trophies, but conducted elaborate rituals that transformed each taking into a ceremony that honored the warrior's courage while claiming his spiritual power for future use in warfare against other enemies. Lieutenant Torres, the last officer to die, spoke fluent Spanish and enough Apache to understand the chants that accompanied his killing. The warriors weren't expressing hatred or celebrating victory, but were conducting religious ceremonies that would carry the power of defeated enemies back to their people and ensure success in future battles against white soldiers. The scalping of the 12 officers required nearly 2 hours of careful work that followed precise ceremonial requirements. Each scalp had to be taken in a specific manner that preserved both hair and spiritual essence, then prepared through rituals that would integrate the defeated enemy's power into Apache warfare capabilities. Private Hayes, who survived by hiding in a ravine until the Apache finished their work and departed, later provided the only eyewitness account of the scalping ceremony. His testimony, buried in military files and never released to newspapers, described rituals that combined practical warfare with religious observance in ways that challenged every assumption about Indian motivation and capabilities. The Apache arranged the 12 scalps in a pattern that corresponded to their understanding of spiritual geography, creating a map of victory that would guide future warfare against white invaders. Each scalp was treated with specific herbs and blessed through chants that connected individual deaths to larger patterns of resistance against American expansion. Naiche examined each officer's personal belongings with the attention of a military historian, studying maps, letters, and equipment to understand white tactical thinking and identify weaknesses that could be exploited in future battles. The Apache had learned that defeating enemies required understanding their minds as well as their weapons. Lieutenant Morrison's mathematical instruments particularly interested the Apache leader, who recognized their value in the kind of precise tactical planning that had made this victory possible. These tools would be distributed among Apache war chiefs who would use them to plan future attacks with the same precision that white soldiers used in their campaigns. The ritual concluded with prayers that honored the courage of defeated enemies while claiming their spiritual power for Apache use in the continuing war against American expansion. The 12 officers had died not just as individuals but as representatives of a military system that the Apache had studied, understood, and systematically defeated. By 1:30 p.m., the battlefield was silent except for wind through the grass and the distant sound of carrion birds beginning their work. The Apache had completed their ceremony and departed, carrying with them scalps and knowledge that would influence Indian warfare for years to come. The 12 scalps would be displayed during victory celebrations that took place throughout Apache territory, serving as proof that white military power could be defeated through superior tactics, spiritual preparation, and the kind of coordination that American officers believed was impossible among Indian forces. Colonel Marcus Reno's column discovered the massacre site on June 27, 2 days after the Apache had completed their work and departed for the sacred mountains where victory celebrations would honor the 12 scalps and integrate their spiritual power into tribal warfare capabilities. The scene that greeted Reno's men challenged every assumption about civilized warfare and demonstrated Apache tactical superiority in ways that military reports would struggle to explain. Dr. Henry Hartwell, the regimental surgeon who accompanied Reno's force, had served through the Civil War and treated casualties from numerous Indian battles, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic precision of Apache scalping techniques. His medical examination revealed that each of the 12 officers had been killed through methods that demonstrated intimate knowledge of human anatomy and sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. The scalping had been performed with surgical precision that preserved maximum hair length while ensuring that spiritual essence remained intact according to Apache religious requirements. Dr. Hartwell's report, classified by military authorities and never released to families or newspapers, described techniques that exceeded anything in medical textbooks and suggested cultural sophistication that contradicted popular beliefs about Indian savagery. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Benteen, whose battalion had been searching for Custer's missing command, recognized immediately that the Little Bighorn Massacre represented a fundamental shift in Indian warfare capabilities. The coordination between Apache and Plains tribes indicated strategic planning that transcended traditional tribal boundaries and created unified resistance to American expansion. Major James Brisbane of the 2nd Cavalry, whose experience in Indian fighting stretched back 15 years, had never seen battlefield evidence of such sophisticated tactical planning. The positioning of bodies, the systematic destruction of equipment, and the ceremonial arrangement of personal belongings suggested military analysis that exceeded the capabilities of most white officers. The Apache had left clear messages for future military expeditions through the specific methods used in mutilating bodies and destroying equipment. Each act of destruction followed patterns that communicated tactical information about Apache capabilities while serving psychological warfare purposes that would influence the behavior of soldiers who discovered the massacre site. Captain Thomas Weir, whose company had served with distinction in previous Indian campaigns, found himself unable to maintain military discipline among men who had witnessed the aftermath of Apache warfare. Several soldiers required medical treatment for shock, and others requested transfers to posts where they wouldn't encounter enemies capable of such systematic brutality. The military's official investigation, conducted by Colonel John Gibbon and sealed from public access for 50 years, concluded that the Apache had achieved tactical surprise through intelligence gathering that exceeded anything the Army believed possible among Indian forces. The massacre represented strategic thinking rather than random violence and demonstrated coordination that challenged fundamental assumptions about Indian military capabilities. General Alfred Terry, commanding the Department of Dakota, recognized that news of the massacre could not be released to newspapers or families without triggering panic throughout frontier settlements. The systematic nature of the killings, combined with evidence of Apache Plains-Indian cooperation, suggested that military authorities faced unified resistance that exceeded their current capabilities to suppress. Dr. Hartwell's autopsy reports, restricted to classified military files, revealed that several officers had been kept alive during extended torture that followed Apache ceremonial requirements rather than sadistic impulses. The torture had served religious purposes that transformed individual deaths into spiritual victories that would enhance tribal warfare capabilities in future battles. The 12 scalps, according to intelligence gathered from friendly Indians, had been distributed among Apache war chiefs who would use them in ceremonies designed to transfer the spiritual power of defeated enemies to tribal warriors. This religious dimension of warfare exceeded anything in military planning and suggested that the Apache were fighting for spiritual as well as territorial objectives. Military authorities faced an unprecedented intelligence problem: how to combat enemies who understood white tactical thinking better than most officers understood Indian capabilities. The massacre had revealed strategic sophistication that challenged every assumption about racial superiority and military effectiveness that guided American expansion policies. The bodies of the 12 officers were buried in a mass grave that bore no markers identifying individual names or providing details about the manner of death. Military records listed them as killed in action against hostile Indians, without mentioning scalping or the ceremonial aspects of their deaths that would have revealed Apache tactical and spiritual sophistication. Word of the massacre traveled through military channels but was officially classified to prevent panic among frontier populations and avoid encouraging other tribes to adopt Apache methods. The Army faced a new kind of warfare that transcended traditional military responses and required fundamental changes in tactical thinking and strategic planning. The Apache victory celebration took place in the sacred Dragoon Mountains of Arizona Territory, where tribal leaders from across the Southwest gathered to honor the 12 scalps and integrate their spiritual power into ongoing resistance against American expansion. Nate presented each scalp with detailed accounts of how it had been taken and what tactical lessons could be learned from the battle. The ceremony lasted 4 days and included rituals that connected individual victories to larger patterns of spiritual warfare that transcended specific battles or campaigns. Apache medicine men conducted blessing ceremonies that would distribute the power of defeated officers among tribal warriors who would carry enhanced capabilities into future conflicts with white soldiers. Chief Cochise, though dying of cancer, participated in ceremonies that honored the tactical brilliance of the Little Bighorn victory while planning future operations that would exploit intelligence gathered from captured military documents and equipment. The Apache had learned that defeating white armies required understanding their strategic thinking as well as their weapons and tactics. The 12 scalps were incorporated into sacred bundles that would accompany Apache war parties in future battles, providing spiritual protection while serving as psychological weapons that demonstrated tribal capabilities to enemies who believed they possessed superior military technology and training. Each scalp carried specific power that enhanced different aspects of warfare. Lieutenant Morrison's scalp, taken from an officer whose mathematical skills had impressed Apache observers, would provide tactical planning capabilities that enhanced precision in future ambush operations. The Apache understood that spiritual power could be transferred through proper ceremonies and would give their warriors access to white technical knowledge. Geronimo himself examined the captured military instruments and documents, studying white tactical methods while identifying weaknesses that could be exploited in future battles. The Apache had learned that winning wars required understanding enemies better than they understood themselves, and captured intelligence provided unprecedented insight into American military thinking. The victory celebrations included war dances that honored individual courage while reinforcing tribal unity and commitment to continued resistance against American expansion. Young Apache warriors who participated in these ceremonies would carry the spiritual power of the 12 scalps into future battles that would shape the course of the Indian Wars. Meanwhile, at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Military authorities struggled to explain the loss of Company L without revealing the tactical sophistication that had made Apache victory possible. Official reports emphasized the overwhelming numbers of hostile Indians while minimizing evidence of superior planning and coordination that had made the massacre inevitable. Families of the 12 officers received standard death notifications that provided no details about the manner of death or the ceremonial scalping that had followed. Military authorities believed that revealing Apache capabilities would undermine civilian morale and encourage other tribes to adopt similar tactics against isolated military units. The intelligence value of the massacre extended beyond immediate tactical lessons to strategic understanding of how Indian resistance could adapt and evolve in response to American military pressure. The Apache had demonstrated that traditional warfare could be combined with sophisticated intelligence gathering and psychological warfare in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial and technological superiority. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the Division of the Missouri, received classified reports about the massacre but made no changes to military policy or tactics that would have acknowledged Apache capabilities. Military doctrine continued to emphasize conventional approaches that had proven ineffective against enemies who understood white weaknesses better than officers understood Indian strengths. The 12 officers had died not just as individuals but as representatives of a military system that had failed to understand the nature of the conflict they were fighting. Their scalps would serve Apache purposes for decades, providing spiritual power while demonstrating to other tribes that white military superiority was not inevitable or insurmountable. Dr. Hartwell's medical studies, conducted without official authorization, revealed that Apache knowledge of human anatomy exceeded anything taught in military medical training. The systematic nature of torture and scalping suggested cultural sophistication that contradicted racist assumptions about Indian capabilities and challenged fundamental beliefs about civilizational superiority. The massacre had revealed a new phase of the Indian Wars in which tribal resistance would be characterized by strategic coordination, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare that exceeded anything military planners had anticipated. The Apache had proven that traditional enemies could adapt and evolve in ways that made conventional military responses obsolete. The long-term consequences of the Little Bighorn officer massacre extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat to reshape American understanding of Indian warfare capabilities and challenge fundamental assumptions about racial and technological superiority that had guided expansion policies. The Apache had demonstrated that traditional enemies could adapt sophisticated military methods while maintaining spiritual traditions that enhanced rather than hindered their effectiveness. Military intelligence reports, classified for decades after the event, revealed that Apache tactical innovations pioneered during the massacre influenced Indian warfare throughout the Southwest and contributed to the prolonged resistance that characterized the final phase of the Indian Wars. The scalping ceremony had created spiritual resources that enhanced Apache capabilities while demonstrating to other tribes that white military power could be systematically defeated through superior planning and coordination. The 12 scalps continued to serve ceremonial purposes throughout the 1880s, appearing at victory celebrations and religious ceremonies that honored Apache resistance while providing spiritual guidance for younger warriors who would inherit the conflict with American expansion. Each scalp retained its individual significance while contributing to collective tribal power that transcended specific battles or campaigns. Lieutenant Morrison's mathematical instruments, captured during the massacre, were used by Apache war chiefs to plan ambush operations with precision that exceeded anything in their traditional tactical repertoire. The combination of white technical knowledge with Indian strategic thinking created hybrid warfare capabilities that military authorities had never anticipated and proved unable to counter effectively. The intelligence gathered from personal correspondence and military documents found on the dead officers provided Apache leaders with unprecedented insight into American strategic planning and revealed weaknesses in military organization that could be exploited in future conflicts. The Apache had learned that defeating enemies required understanding their minds as well as their weapons. Within 6 months of the massacre, Apache war parties throughout Arizona Territory began implementing tactical innovations that had been demonstrated at Little Bighorn. The captured military manuals were translated by Apache linguists and distributed among tribal war councils, creating a standardized approach to anti-cavalry warfare that proved devastatingly effective in subsequent encounters. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered during the scalping of the 12 officers became standard Apache practice in dealing with isolated military units. The systematic mutilation and ceremonial arrangement of bodies served multiple purposes: honoring spiritual traditions, terrorizing future enemies, and demonstrating tactical sophistication that challenged white assumptions about Indian capabilities. Nate, who had planned and executed the massacre, became a legendary figure whose tactical innovations influenced Apache warfare for the remainder of the Indian Wars. His combination of traditional spiritual preparation with sophisticated military analysis created a model that other war chiefs attempted to emulate in their own resistance to American expansion. The success at Little Bighorn encouraged Apache leaders to expand their intelligence networks throughout the Southwest, recruiting tribal members, traders, and sympathetic civilians who could provide information about military movements and strategic planning. This intelligence apparatus eventually extended from the Mexican border to the Canadian frontier, creating unprecedented coordination among traditionally independent tribal groups. Captain John Burke, serving under General George Crook in Arizona Territory, noted in his classified reports that Apache tactical effectiveness had increased dramatically following the Little Bighorn engagement. The systematic nature of their attacks, the precision of their intelligence gathering, and their ability to anticipate military responses suggested capabilities that exceeded anything in his 15 years of frontier service. The psychological impact of the massacre extended throughout the frontier military establishment, where knowledge of Apache capabilities created reluctance to undertake isolated patrol operations and contributed to the concentration of forces that characterized later phases of the Indian Wars. Officers who had previously considered Indian fighting routine began to understand that they faced enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything in their military education. Dr. Hartwell's classified medical studies revealed that Apache knowledge of human anatomy and physiology exceeded anything available in contemporary medical textbooks and suggested cultural sophistication that contradicted racist assumptions about Indian intellectual capabilities. His reports, suppressed by military authorities, documented techniques that wouldn't be understood by white medical practitioners until decades later. The systematic nature of the scalping revealed surgical precision that required extensive anatomical knowledge and specialized tools that had been developed through generations of warfare. Each scalp had been removed using techniques that maximized both hair preservation and spiritual significance, suggesting medical expertise that challenged contemporary beliefs about Indian cultural development. Dr. Hartwell's autopsy reports, sealed in military archives for 50 years, documented evidence of anesthetic techniques that allowed Apache warriors to keep victims conscious during extended torture while preventing death from shock or blood loss. These methods suggested pharmacological knowledge that exceeded anything available to military medical personnel. The torture techniques employed during the final phase of the massacre followed precise patterns that served both religious and psychological purposes. Apache warriors understood human physiology well enough to prolong suffering while ensuring that victims remained conscious for ceremonies that transformed individual deaths into spiritual victories for tribal warfare capabilities. The massacre site itself became sacred ground for Apache spiritual practices, where young warriors would visit to receive blessings that connected them to the power of the 12 defeated officers. The location served as a pilgrimage destination that reinforced tribal unity while providing tangible evidence that white military superiority could be overcome through proper spiritual preparation and tactical planning. Apache medicine men established permanent ceremonial sites at key locations throughout the Little Bighorn battlefield, creating a sacred landscape that would influence tribal religious practices for generations. These sites were connected through spiritual geography that transformed the entire region into a source of power for continued resistance against American expansion. The 12 scalps were incorporated into tribal medicine bundles that accompanied Apache war parties on raids throughout the Southwest, providing spiritual protection while serving as psychological weapons that demonstrated capabilities to enemies who encountered them. Each scalp retained specific powers that enhanced different aspects of warfare, from tactical planning to individual courage in combat. Young Apache warriors underwent initiation ceremonies at the massacre site that connected them to the spiritual power of the 12 defeated officers while teaching tactical lessons that had made the victory possible. These ceremonies ensured that knowledge gained during the battle would be preserved and transmitted to future generations of tribal fighters. General George Crook, whose later campaigns against the Apache demonstrated some understanding of their capabilities, privately acknowledged that the Little Bighorn officer massacre represented a fundamental shift in Indian warfare that required completely different military approaches. However, his recommendations for tactical innovation were largely ignored by military authorities who preferred conventional responses to unprecedented challenges. The families of the 12 officers never learned the true circumstances of their deaths or understood the ceremonial significance of their scalps in Apache religious practices. Military authorities maintained the fiction that their relatives had died in conventional combat rather than acknowledging the sophisticated warfare that had made their deaths inevitable and meaningful to enemies who understood spiritual as well as physical dimensions of conflict. The Apache victory at Little Bighorn represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated that traditional cultures could adapt and evolve in response to technological challenges while maintaining spiritual foundations that enhanced rather than hindered their effectiveness. The 12 scalps served as permanent reminders that cultural sophistication and military capability were not monopolized by white civilization. Modern historians who have gained access to classified military records acknowledge that the Apache massacre of 12 cavalry officers represented one of the most sophisticated tactical operations in the history of Indian warfare and revealed capabilities that military authorities of the time were unable to understand or effectively counter. The scalps themselves disappeared into Apache oral tradition, where their power continues to influence tribal memory of successful resistance to American expansion. The legacy of the 12 officers extends beyond their individual deaths to encompass broader questions about cultural contact, military adaptation, and the role of spiritual beliefs in shaping tactical effectiveness. Their scalps became symbols of Apache capability that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial superiority and demonstrated that traditional enemies could master complex military methods while maintaining cultural integrity that enhanced their effectiveness in conflict. Today, the Little Bighorn battlefield draws thousands of visitors who come to understand Custer's last stand, but few realize that the most sophisticated tactical victory occurred when Apache warriors demonstrated that Indian military capabilities exceeded anything white officers had imagined possible. The 12 scalps taken that day represented not just individual defeats but the systematic dismantling of racist assumptions about warfare, intelligence, and cultural superiority that had guided American expansion into Indian territory. Share your thoughts about this forgotten chapter of American military history in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories where documented evidence reveals uncomfortable truths about conflicts that shaped the American West. Hit that notification bell because next week we'll explore Belle Starr of Tombstone and how one woman's rope changed frontier justice forever. The scalps of 12 cavalry officers remain among the most powerful symbols of Indian military sophistication and serve as permanent reminders that cultural superiority in warfare belonged to those who understood both spiritual and tactical dimensions of conflict.